Bom dia para quem é de bom dia, boa noite para quem é da boa noite, boa tarde para quem acabou de receber a chamadinha e veio assistir mais um bate-papo Mayhem. E você viu a chamada, é um tarô, é grego, tem magia no meio, então tudo que vocês gostam. E a gente chama um cara que é mega especialista, o cara tem vários livros escritos e a gente vai ter que conversar em inglês. Então, a primeira coisa que você tem que fazer é escolher aqui embaixo subtitles e depois colocar translate to português. E aí você vai entender o que a gente está falando. And now I have to speak in English. How are you, Jason? Welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the reason we invited you is because of your new tarot deck. But we discovered you have lots of books, so we have a lot of things to talk about today. And most of all, I realized that we do have one book of yours in Portuguese, but I believe it's a mock-up copy. Someone translated here, and I believe several years ago, I found it lost inside some archives. But officially, we don't have anything from you. So I have to introduce you to the Brazilian audience first. So the first question that I would like to ask you is about a journey. How did you get into magic? Why did you begin to write, and how's everything?
Well, looking backward over my life now, because I've been involved in magic for at least 35 years, it seems like it was just destined to be. You know, there were things that came into my life and in my path that sort of guided me in the direction of magic and the occult. When I was about 11, I first discovered the tarot, and I discovered it actually at a church youth group. We basically were talking about divination, and someone had a book on different forms of divination, and I saw the Rider-Waite tarot images in it, and I thought these are something that's really interesting and special and unique, and I need to, you know, learn something about this. The first book that I bought was a book on witchcraft that's quite popular here in the United States called it's Raymond Buckland's Book of Witchcraft. It's a big blue book. I'm like, the exact title eludes me, but pretty quickly from there, I started reading about more Golden Dawn oriented things. Aleister Crowley's Magic in Theory and Practice was an early book of mine, and various sort of grimoire kind of books were early in my reading. And pretty quick with that same friend, we decided to do a few magical experiments, and they always worked out not quite how we'd imagined them, but there was always something strange that happened that made me go, well, there's something to all this, because there's some sort of result happening as like we did something and then all the pictures on his walls seemed to be sort of crooked, and we did another invocation of some demonic entity, and while it didn't come to the circle, we swore that we saw like a young boy running across the room, you know, in a different area. So, you know, there were lots of encouraging moments, and I kept studying it. I don't think he did all that much more than what we worked on in our youth, but I continued exploring it, and eventually I joined magical orders and became involved with a more formal study. My initial training was with Aleister Crowley oriented, thelemic oriented groups. I was in the OTO and the AA, and my involvement in the AA was interesting because I had a fairly illustrious person as my direct overseer, and he was a little bit jaded towards the whole process and wasn't all that interested in being a really active guiding force for me. So I ended up actually interacting with the person who I'd first initially interact with more than with my actual teacher. And so pretty quickly, I just decided that I was going to do the Abramelin operation, or my version of the Abramelin operation. So I just, you know, I'd been initiated into the order, and was in a period in which I was supposed to just be doing whatever magic I thought best to do, along with memorizing a couple of things. And so I just basically was like, I'm just going to do the Augmentin operation as my work that I'm doing here. So, you know, I did that. And, you know, as a result of that work, a number of things happened. You know, first of all, I did create a contact with my higher and divine genius, as far as I understand it to be. And my life and my work has been guided by that since that time period. But as a result of that, I felt like I less and less fit in with the OTO or with the AA as it was structured. And so I found myself distancing myself from it. And I wrote a book, which was my second book, which not my personal overseer, but a person above him felt was in competition with AA, and that was called the New Hermetics. And so they basically said, you know, if you want to continue with AA, don't publish this book. And I said, okay, well, I guess you've made my choice for me. I'm going to publish my book. So, you know, so I kind of, you know, I still, I guess, consider myself a part of that movement on some level, but at the same time, I also see myself as having really kind of, you know, transcended and moved into my own work, which is, you know, doing my thing. So my magical work really was very connected from even in that early time period with work on more modern kinds of consciousness exploration, hypnosis, and neurolinguistic programming. And due to the fact that I was influenced somewhat by the writings of like Robert Anton Wilson and some of those folks over at the Falcon Press, I felt like magic was a looser concept, and that those things weren't, you know, it has come to my attention that some people view those sorts of things as sort of not magical on an inherent level, and I never felt that way. And so my writings kind of, you know, fit with that paradigm. I do get a little bit annoyed when people say that my work is psychological magic, because I don't feel like that's really a good descriptor for it, and I don't feel like, you know, that's a word that's being used not as a way of understanding, but rather as a way of classifying and otherizing different people's ways of approaching things. You know, so it's basically trying to exclude me from a you know, their club, and make me the person who is doing something different and wrong, which I don't agree with, and I don't see myself as doing a different sort of work than theirs. If anything, I see mine as being more in line with what the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley's AA were intending to have happen, which was that we would be growing our consciousness towards higher places, and, you know, discovering our innate or our hidden genius inside ourselves, and be able to express it more fully, to express the true will in the world. And that's, you know, that the work that the New Hermetics covers is really about sort of stripping away the things that aren't your true will to discover that, you know, hidden inside you. So my studies have really been pretty varied. You know, when my first few books, I was largely in the thelemic paradigm, so my reading was a little bit less full than it has become since then. I spent a lot more time reading, you know, scholastic work, and reading, you know, older texts translated into English, or even making some pathetic attempts at trying to translate some of it myself. So, you know, my work has changed and evolved quite a lot over time.
That was great. We do have a lot of questions for you. The first question is, what is magic to you, based on your concept? And what was magic to you before you're a Brahmalin, and then after you get out of the AA? I believe, for what you say, you have three steps into magic. Can you tell us a little more about that?
I mean, I think my perception of what magic is has been fairly consistent, although I think that as a concept, it tends to be a little bit elusive and difficult to understand. But basically, magic for me is the various systems of understanding how the universe comes into being through various levels of divine consciousness, and learning to work with those different levels so that you can make changes. I mean, a lot of magic really is about being able to understand the subtle forces that are moving us, and there are a lot of different ways of doing that, from reading cards or some other form of drawing lots, those kinds of things. And then astrology is another method of understanding things. And so those two ways of trying to understand what's going on an invisible level then naturally become activated when we then try to either change where things are going or to enforce what we see as already kind of coming into being. And so magic is a way of trying to influence the universe's manifestation in such a way that things come about by our design. And I think that it's both something that you do, but it's also something that you are and that you experience too.
Tell us a little more about the process, and how was it to meet your holy guardian angel? We have interviewed several magicians that attained this level, and we are collecting their stories. And we even interviewed psychology from London that were studying the effects of the bromelain on the human mind. And he is a psychologist. He's not a magician or a wizard or anything. He's a scientist. And he said that in 2020, 2021, the whole world was experiencing some form of this bromelain.
Right. The isolation and the but not necessarily the devotion and the and the transformative work. The more people were binging streaming services like Netflix and Hulu rather than doing devotional prayers. So the Abramelin operation, there's really two distinct things that are called the Abramelin operation at this point, and I think they have fairly distinct purposes. So and they're like my friend Aaron Leach, we've been arguing about the Abramelin operation for like 20 years. But the easiest way I think to reconcile it is to realize that there's the Abramelin operation as defined in that grimoire or short story or whatever you want to call it, that operation, exactly how it is presented there. And then it was reinterpreted through the Golden Dawn and most especially through Aleister Crowley into a somewhat different ritual that they continued to call the Abramelin operation in an informal sense, but wasn't necessarily quite what the Abramelin operation was initially in the text of the late medieval, early Renaissance text that is called The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage. My work that I did was probably more closely aligned with the Crowley Thelemic version of it than it would be aligned with the classical grimoire sense. And so in that, what a person who's doing the classical grimoire is attempting to connect with some sort of guide angel or a system of angels that are quite literally looked at as being a part of the Judeo-Christian levels of reality. And the Crowley version of it is a bit more freeform than that, in that he really didn't believe in that system quite that way, and so wasn't really trying to get you to do exactly that. Instead, what he was trying to get you to do was to get in touch with that inner divinity that is within all of us, that is the guiding force of our incarnation. And that, I think nowadays it's more called the daemon than it is the holy guardian angel. That I think is a more accurate word for it, in that daemon really represents your fate, your destiny, your how things are going to play out in your life, whereas holy guardian angel is much more of a part of a metaphysics that, I mean, ultimately they aren't necessarily a different being per se, but one's expectations and attitudes in the encounter are probably different. A person who does the Abramelin operation in a classic way, those who I've talked to, very often their knowledge and conversation isn't really on a mystical level. It's more on the sense that they feel like they have this, you know, voice that guides them sometimes, and they, you know, sometimes even speak to them with a pendulum or some other way of connecting with them. Whereas my experience was much more an experience of transcendence, of the literal sense of otherness in the universe completely collapsing into an understanding of myself as being, you know, not lost, but integrated within something much greater than the egoic Jason Augustus Newcomb. It was much more of a spiritual experience than it was a conversational experience, although I do feel very guided by that connection that I've established, and pretty much everything that I do comes through that sort of avenue of consciousness between us. But I don't view it as being completely a separate being from myself, although it's certainly not me in any sense of the word, and it's not my best qualities or anything like that. Rather, it is a nexus point in consciousness where I am plugging into something far vaster than my personal self.
So it's not an external being nor an internal being. It's something in between.
It's, yeah. I mean, I think that where it lives for me is a place where those kinds of questions don't make as much sense, because we're all a part of this continuum of consciousness, and it's just this much vaster and more you know, plugged into the universe consciousness than my own is, because, you know, I have a function to do things in this material world, and I have, you know, activities, and I have desires, and I have things, and that none of that is present in this being. But yes, it does reside basically inside me in a sense, but I mean, like that sort of a sense of like location is a bit, I don't know that it really even makes that much sense for me, because it's like saying, you know, where is God, you know, or, you know, where is eternity? You know, it's kind of everywhere, and it's a connecting point between my consciousness and eternity.
Yeah, the reason I ask you that, because here in Brazil we have the Umbanda and Candomblé and other Afro religions.
Sure.
And we do a lot with these spirits. And in the United States, you have a completely different point of view on these entities. Now, spirituality in the United States is more like the ghost stories from films and everything. And in Brazil, it's part of the tradition. And you talk to ghosts, sure. You have their ancestors and everything like that. And in magic too, we have versions of Abramelin from our religion, from Umbanda and Candomblé, but they are, as we said, they are crash courses, because you spend 21 days, but you're locked in like a 2x3 meters room. So you see anything but this small room, and it's like a very heavy process. And in the end, you will meet other entities, like. But some of the mages who did the Abramelin in the traditional sense, they describe that they talk to the angel, or some others describe the same things as you did, the conscious that connect us to these authors.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that working with entities, I don't think that there's anything wrong with working with your holy guardian angel as a separate entity from yourself, and I work with entities that are other than myself, you know, gods and angels and the occasional demon here and there, but I don't view them as being a part of my mind or being something that is within the microcosm of Jason Augustus Newcomb, but I do view them as being somewhere, like the holy guardian angel is in this nexus point, and they are past that nexus point. We are the guiding spirit, the guiding genius is sort of your gateway to the rest of the spiritual intelligences in the universe. And while I think they are discrete and can be discrete, they can also be the same. They don't have the same sort of strict boundaries between them that we do. If you and I are in the same room, we're not ever going to be the same person, but they don't have that spatial problem that we do. It's just not a part of their function. So
I have a question from Father AASL. Did you use tarot during the Abramelin ritual? And did tarot help you?
Yes. I actually used tarot a lot during my Abramelin operation as sort of astral gateways to go and explore things at the level at which those cards were meaningful to me at that time. So basically the tarot card would be something on my altar, and I would, enter an altered state of one kind or another and go through the card and talk to entities on the other side. And that was a significant portion of what I was doing actually in the operation. There was a ritual component to it that I did multiple times a day, but then there was a visionary component in which I was sort of opening myself up to various experiences along the way.
All right, and I see here you have before this Greek Papyrus magical tarot, you have a first one that it's the Hermetic. You wrote it after you did the Abramelin. How was the inspiration to do that tarot?
So that tarot had a really confined focus, which was taking the tree of life and looking at it as a set of possible magical or mystical actions that one could take. And this wasn't something that I invented or created. Aleister Crowley actually has an almost identical map that he created of what you do in the grades according to where it falls on the tree of life. So my tarot was basically just a development of that concept that was sort of guided by the processes that I've been through. But yeah, it was very confined to a somewhat practical device to kind of understand the kinds of magic that can sit at different points on the tree of life, and the kinds of new hermetics exercises, so to speak, that you could do at different points on the tree of life. So actually, along with the Greek Magical Papyri Tarot, I actually have a third tarot that I've created, which is again related to the new hermetics, but instead of, it takes kind of the opposite tack to it, which is that basically it's like a divinatory deck, except that instead of getting an answer, you're getting an action to take. So you basically, I don't know if I have any of them here, but the deck has it's like a bunch of instructions on each card. So there's 78 cards for the tarot, but it suggests that you do one of the new hermetics tools, one of three choices, because somewhere in my neurolinguistic programming training, I was told that when you have two choices of things you can do, you have a dilemma, but when you have three choices, suddenly you have a much more rich set of possibilities of what you might want to do. So basically the card suggests, take an action or like explore this aspect of your consciousness, and then it has three different possible tools that you can use for that purpose. So that's a separate deck that I'm sort of launching. I've had it kind of in the pipeline for a long time, but I decided to launch it at the same time as this deck. But it's obviously again a pretty specialized deck for a person who really wants that specific kind of thing, whereas the tarot of the Greek Magical Papyri is a little bit more universal in its application as a tarot.
And this Greek tarot is the one that we are in love here. We were talking to you before we recording that to get this kind of products here in Brazil is very difficult because the law here considers tarot gambling.
Sure.
So we have a lot of taxes and everything got very expensive. So it's cheaper for us if we could produce it here. But how's it going? The Indiegogo, you are in a, it's not a Kickstarter, it's Indiegogo one. Yeah?
An Indiegogo campaign. Yeah, I've used them several times, and I don't remember why I chose them over Kickstarter, but it was years ago. So I've done one Kickstarter campaign, and I've done 6 Indiegogo campaigns. So it's going great. We've been doing it for 1 week now. It was launched at 6 p.m. last Monday, and we've already raised over $30,000. So
wow,
it's going phenomenally well, much faster than I had ever hoped. So I hope it continues to go well, and that people keep investing in it. But
that's really great. And I have the question that Breno wrote is if you could tell us about the creation of this deck. How was the procedures and inspiration and everything?
It's funny because it's one of those things where, again, I feel like I'm guided to do things, and I don't always 100% understand why I'm doing them. So I kind of started the deck before I even really quite knew where it was going. I drew this image and this image. I don't know if you can see the other one, but the Hecate image and the Typhon image. Oh, and the Hermes image. So those were the first 3 that I drew, and I knew it was a tarot deck, but I didn't quite. Other than that, I didn't quite know where it was going beyond that, and it sort of unfolded itself for me as I was going along. But the reason that I wanted to create the deck is there's a few different reasons. Probably my initial reasoning was that I didn't feel like there was a deck that really connected well with the ancient magic that I've been getting more and more into over the last few years. The tarot feels, even at its most sort of, the eldest ones, the Italian and French designs, they feel very European and very, not connected with anything past, the Middle Ages per se. So I wanted to tap into a more ancient strata, and when I started I had an inspiration that I would like to design it based on ancient Greek pottery, because the way that they did ancient Greek pottery, it's got a sort of a quick feel to it. Like even ones that are extremely detailed, you can tell that the person doing it was doing it at a rapid rate, most likely because they were trying to get 10 done in a single day. So it has a sort of a drawing quality to it that I liked. I liked the idea that it's something that would be in someone's life, and that this is the way the gods would have appeared to a person who was just living their life in the ancient world. So that and then I started looking at some of the art, and I was like, wow, a lot of these images kind of almost look like tarot cards to begin with. They've got they've the image of, say, Hermes here. He kind of looks like the fool or the magician, just in the way that he's moving. And so it just immediately I thought this is going to work, and I didn't have any idea people were going to like it quite as much as they have, but basically I tend to wait for inspiration to come, so if there's a part that I was like, I don't know what this card would be in the ancient, I just would sit and wait, and eventually it would just come to me, or an image would come along. So I mean, it was a very inspired effort. The small cards have a somewhat different things going on, and again, those were very much inspired by just sort of what felt like the right thing to do. Or actually, at one point, I set up some statues of Hermes and Hecate, and I put all my different ideas on the table with them, and I was like, you guys sort this out, and we sort of sorted it out together, and that's how a lot of the small cards ended up getting made.
And for the people that do not know yet, they are drawings or they're pictures of the pottery?
No, they're drawings. They're my drawings. They're
really beautiful.
What I wanted to do at first was to try and imitate exactly the way that an ancient artist would have drawn them. But I quickly noticed, one, that there were a lot of different ancient artists, that there were different artists had different styles, and there were a lot of different variations. So eventually I came to the idea that I should probably just imagine what it would be like if I were an ancient potter. What would my style look like, you know? So I've tried to harmonize a lot of the images. Every one of the images has something to do with an image that actually exists. None of them are just completely free creations. But like some images were more detailed, and then there's another kind of pottery called black figure pottery, and some of the deities that I wanted to put into the deck only exist in black, or at least that I was able to find. So I had to sort of, you know, pull that out, change the art style of it so that it would match with the rest of these ones. So, you know, there's been some creative monkeying around with things, but they're all pretty closely based on the way that they would have looked back then.
And how's the connection between the magic and the tarot in this deck?
This deck is a very magical deck. First of all, I've dispensed with the names that you usually see on tarot cards, and instead I just have the name of the deity. Here's Helios, and just says Helios on it. In the book that comes along with it, I'll explain kind of where, and actually even the sheet that comes along with it will explain where I see it fitting within the tarot deck. But I intentionally designed them this way because I realized that there might be people who'd really like to use this deck, but they don't agree with my way of organizing the cards. So why not just leave it open so that people can interpret them the way that they feel comfortable utilizing them? And at this point, there's going to be quite a few additional cards that I'm making, because I had stretch goals for my campaign that we blew through in 7 days. Every one of my stretch goals has been gone through at this point. So I'm adding some additional cards that someone could either just have a bigger tarot and, you know, dispense with the idea of it having to be 78 cards and have more cards in it, or they could take out one of the cards that's in the initial set and replace it with a different one. So it's a very flexible tool. And so, you know, in terms of magic with these cards, I think, first of all, they can become icons of you know, the beings that you can utilize in a ritual sense. But they can also be utilized for exactly the purpose I mentioned earlier, which is as a gateway to go and work with the you know, the being or beings connected with this card's energy. Let me see if I can find. So the small cards are quite directly magical. They're kind of you know, sorceress in a way. They have so one of the things that I noticed about, particularly amongst the black figure pottery, which I decided to do the small cards in black figure pottery style, I noticed that they were very often in a horizontal tableau that would be, you know, long, as opposed to being an up and down thing. So it felt like it was never going to look right if I filled the whole frame with these guys here. So I realized that pottery also tends to have these like areas in it, where there's one area that's like the top part, and then there's another, you know, it might have a few, you know, animals in it or something, and then there's another area that has some figures in it, and then there's an area at the bottom that has just sort of designs. So I decided that I was going to put a talisman. This is a talisman from the Greek magical papyri, and then have a little tableau of, you know, little black figures doing various things. And then I took a little bit of the Homer oracle, which is an oracle that exists in the Greek magical papyri that is essentially just little snippets, little quotes from Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, and they're quite random in a lot of ways. But I tried to choose ones that I either felt matched the energy of the card, or at least had some relationship with the card, and then they could be interpreted in more than one way because they're pretty ambiguous. This particular one is not all that ambiguous. It says, "Take heart, let these matters not trouble your mind," and that is because this tarot card it's the Two of Swords, and it has to do with sort of contending forces in a peaceful moment. So and so this talisman is one for restraining anger as well. So the whole deck has this like magical quality to the cards, and some of the cards, because there are some quite negative tarot cards in it, some of those negative tarot cards have a talisman that is kind of the opposite, like it's a talisman to work against that negative energy, and some of them it just is the negative thing, and that's the reasoning for that. I can't really take credit for it. My Hermes and Hecate helped me make those decisions. So any mistakes I take responsibility for, but the inspiration was largely beyond my capacity.
Yeah. You divided the minor arcana in 4 suits as the common tarot? No.
Yes, and in fact, it has the exact. Well, I mean, if you look at ancient Greek pottery, the main 2 subjects are either people carrying around various kinds of pots, or because like they were it was a funny like thing. Everyone on your pot would have people holding the same kind of pot that you but so I mean, there's women carrying around pots. It's a very common theme, and the other common theme is various warriors either fighting with each other or running or doing something along those lines. So those themes fit really well with the tarot. The only problem is that while there are a few times that swords come up in the Greek pottery, largely the Greeks fought with spears, and I didn't want to have spears and wands because they're too similar to each other, and in some older tarot decks it can sometimes be kind of hard to tell which one's which. So the suits of the tarot fit in pretty well with ancient Greek pottery because they did have walking sticks in quite a lot of them. They did have people carrying cups around in them, largely as kind of a joke, or not a joke, but as sort of like this is a pot, and so we're going to depict people with pots in their hands of the same kind. That's a very frequent thing happening, and it's usually women who are holding those pots, and then there are warriors fighting with each other. And usually the warriors are fighting with spears, though, rather than swords. But I decided to stay with the tarot's sense of swords, and so I mean these are kind of Greek style swords, but they're not probably as accurate to the way that ancient Greeks would have made the cards themselves, simply because they would have probably used spears. But it just seemed like spears and swords or spears and wands are kind of similar to each other. They're almost identical at the pointy end. So I didn't really want to create that confusion any more than I needed to. Although the way that I have them, all the little swords are little warriors, and anyway, they're based on each suit has its own kind of figure, so it's pretty easy to detect which one is which. So yeah, that's the tarot, and the inspiration for it was that I was really interested in the Greek magical papyri and really interested in ancient magic, and wanted to create a tarot that kind of fit more with that. I do tarot reading professionally sometimes, not extremely frequently at this point, but I kind of wanted to create a deck that I could use for that as well. So most likely this will be the deck that I'm using with clients into the future.
And with this, you have a book with the papyri and everything. It is with spells, a magical book. What can you expect from the book that comes with the tarot?
Some of the book has to be completed at this point. I wasn't completely ready for it to go quite as quickly as it has, but yeah, I made some offers to expand the book if people supported the project, and gosh darn it, they supported the project. So yeah, the book is going to be much bigger at this point. So yeah, I mean, there's a spell that goes along with each one of these cards. I'm you know, in my use of them magically, I've kind of adapted them a little bit to a little bit more of a modern approach to things, because of the fact that the images are on the cards rather than being made out of some substance, as they frequently, you know, either on papyrus or carved into clay or carved into tin, or a few things are actually statues that I've turned into images. So I mean, there's an adaptation going on from the beginning. But the truth is that in both that form of magic and other forms of magic, we've changed the medium of magical symbols and devices throughout history. And you know, it's not like I'm inventing something new by doing that.
I have another question from Breno. He said about your tarot, we are seeing a new renaissance of grimoire magic, but not only your project, but the Grimorium Verum and others. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's fine in a lot of ways. I think that the 19th century occult revival that kind of spawned the current interest in magic was an attempt to get away from that, to elevate magic to a slightly higher sphere. And I don't know that they completely succeeded in everything that they were doing, but I think that to a certain extent, what has been winning out is more the sorceress function of magic rather than the evolutionary function of magic. And it could be argued that any kind of magic is going to elevate you to an extent because you're going to be changing your consciousness as you're doing it. But at the same time, I think that the fact that more and more people are gravitating away
You're muted again. I believe there's something wrong with your microphone.
I think we've lost each other a little bit. So.
Yes.
I've noticed that Zoom tends to freeze up when things that are pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, it happens a lot here. We call the Illuminati. We have interviewed about 200 people, and grandmasters, and even Dom Milo Duquette, and they can say blah, 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 blah. But when they are saying something really important, their connection freezes and something weirdo happens. And then after 200 interviews, we are beginning to suspect that it's on purpose.
I agree. I mean, it's definitely happens. So, you know, but maybe we're always saying important things, and so it's just random. But I don't know. So, we were talking about grimoire. And I think that, you know, there's value in that kind of magic, and I think that pretending that that's a more traditional kind of magic is kind of silly, since there's no such thing as a traditional form of magic, because magic has always been an outsider thing and always been something that is not really a part of a, you know, accredited university kind of setting. It's always been something that's kind of been done in, you know, back rooms and hidden places. So the idea of being a more traditional magician, it just seems kind of silly. But I mean, if people like the aesthetics of that, you know, particular period, that's great. If people like the aesthetics of the period that I've been, you know, making stuff for recently, that's great too. I don't think that one of those is superior to the other, and I don't think that even necessarily the evolutionary type of magic is superior, because I've seen a lot of people really get their egos blown out of proportion by being told that they're, you know, an adeptus minor or whatever. You know, they get to starting to think that they're more important than everyone else in the world, and I don't know if that's really all that useful either. So, I mean, I think that there's good and bad things. I think that people wanting to like approach stuff as putting as much effort in as possible so that they're more fully engaging with it is great. I don't know that thinking that if you have some sort of parchment that you've gotten from a deer that you've slain in the forest, that adds a huge amount of effectiveness to what the rest of what you're doing. It changes it, so I mean, it's not the same thing, but I think there's other ways of putting that level of focus into things that also work. It's not just a magical spell or a grimoire procedure or a spell from the Greek magical papyri. It's not really a recipe in the same way that like a cookbook is a recipe. It has some of those components to it, but it's not quite the same thing. And there's more possibilities of substituting something else into it and still having it work out, or doing it absolutely correctly and having it not work out. Just because the situation you set up wasn't really right for it, or the target wasn't something that you have the ability to hit because of your level of sophistication with it or lack of connection with it. I mean,
this what you said in recipe. I think it's great because last week we interviewed a hoodoo priest, and the hoodoo spells are basically that, recipes. That they said,
but at the same time, what's that?
A good magic is magic that works,
right? And I've done some experiments with hoodoo that were quite effective, and I like hoodoo, and yes, it does have a sort of a recipe quality to it too, but it's not just the recipe. The recipe, there's a difference between having someone cook a cake who's never cooked a cake before, who's trying to follow the recipe, but there's certain things that aren't necessary. Like when it says you have to put a cup of flour in, if you press a bunch of flour into the cup, so it's really a lot of flour, you can compress a lot of flour into it, then you're going to have a very dense, horrible cake. You need to only have a little bit of, the flour needs to be light and fluffy that you're putting into it. If you don't understand that inherently, the recipe is going to be misinterpreted all over the place. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's a great explanation. Because you do have the recipe, but you do have the hand of the magician doing
right.
It.
And magicians realize that there's more than one way. I mean, hoodoo is a great example. There are literally hundreds of different operations for the same purpose that you can find in amongst hoodoo practitioners, and those are all ways that they believe work. So there's more than one way to do it. So now if you don't know what you're doing, if you have no idea, and you take one part of one person's idea and another part of another person's idea and smush them together, that's not wise baking, right? I mean, that's not a wise way of approaching things. But at a certain point you can realize, oh, okay, I understand what this is and I understand what this is, so I can combine this together, or I would never want to combine this together, or you begin to understand things in a different way. And I think it's important for people to realize that that's not some far off thing in the distance. It's fairly practical, you don't combine certain things because they don't belong together, and it should be pretty apparent to you after a few experiments whether things go together or not. So I mean, it's not really I don't want people to feel like it's like I'm saying, I'm being elitist by saying that people will understand how to combine things in new ways and do things. I think it's pretty obvious most of the time what goes together and what does not.
No, the question was from Rodrigo, and he said he's a beginner, and if he could use your tarot and the magic there, or if it's made from a most skilled target audience.
I mean, I think to a certain extent, just simply because the images have a certain kind of power to them inherently, I think using the deck, I'm not sure of this because I'm the only person who's used one so far, but it's got sort of an inherent magic to it that that seems very present to me. So I don't know that you could escape from that by utilizing the deck. You know, I think that you're going to be joining into that magical world a little bit by utilizing the deck. But I think there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it. I mean, you can utilize it just like any other tarot. You could utilize it to play the gambling game that tarot was created for, if you wanted to, because it's, you know, it's got that quality. It doesn't have any numbers on it, other than in the citation for the Homer quotes, but that's and that's because they didn't use Arabic or Latin numerals in. I mean, you don't see them in Greek texts much at all. So it seemed weird to even consider it. Of course, you can, like, you know, this is a 2 because there's 2 little guys and there's 2 little swords, but it's not numbered in there at all. But so yeah, there's lots of ways in which it can be used. Would I say you should immediately jump in and start doing spells with the cards? I don't know. Sure.
There's a question from Vera, and she said, will there be king and queen? And did you choose princess and prince?
There are basically 4 kinds of figures in this. There's like a sort of a philosopher king, a warrior, a woman who is probably an artisan, and then a woman who is a either a priestess or some other something like that. And so basically those are the king, queen. So it's a princess, but I mean, it's not as obvious as that, because they're yeah, you'll know which one's which, but they're basically more like figures than necessarily queen, king, prince, princess, or page. And but there's definitely, like, there's a king and there's a warrior, so like he's the knight pretty clearly, and then there's, you know, a woman who is her hair is uncovered, and she actually is she's the cups figure. So you would get to decide for yourself whether she is the more advanced one or not. And in the 16 cards, the woman with her head covered and the woman with her head uncovered, they have a coin or a sword in their hand. So it's not, you know, like, but it's sort of like, if you guys are familiar with the Golden Dawn's way of having sub-elemental categories, that's basically what's going on with them.
It's great. I have a question from Ulysses here. Jason, you have great material about Enochian magic. Could you tell us about your experience with that? So, you know, Enochian magic, it's been a lifelong interest of mine. That it was one of the first books that I read, was actually one of the Hewler's early Enochian magic ones. And so the Enochian letters have always been something that you know, resonated with me and felt very magical. And the way in which I approached Enochian magic was very sort of simple in comparison with, I think, a lot of what people end up doing these days. And it was actually inspired by Lon-Milo Duquette. I'm sure you guys are at least vaguely familiar with him. He had a book. He has 2 books on Enochian magic, but the first one that he had back in the 1990s was a very slender silver or gray book. I think it's called Enochian Sex Magic, it's the Enochian World of Aleister Crowley. Enochian Sex Magic is the title of the book. And it's a very sort of, here's how you can go about doing this. So me and a number of a varying cadre of people started doing ritual work, visionary work based on that book. And that's the majority of the work that I do is really pretty centered in that. Although I've added a little bit of more to it since then, just because I've learned to make things, and so I've made more interesting regalia. But
To me, the Enochian world has become less appealing to me. There's a number of reasons for it. To the beings that I've communicated with from that system have a very sort of apocalyptic attitude. They seem to be wanting to be a part of a world transformation or a world ending, and that I'm not sure that resonates with me as much anymore. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. Like, I'm resisting the apocalypse, but it's not quite that simple. But it's just sort of the interactions that I've had with those beings they become sort of a little oppressive to me, and wanting me to do things or wanting things to happen in the world. And it's just, I've done less and less with it over the years. I still have a heart place for it all in myself, because it was one of the first systems of magic that I really did in a group way, or did in a semi-formal way. Yeah, I think I feel drawn more towards the ancient gods than the angels of the Enochian system. And like I said early on, I'm not sure that they're completely different from one another all the time, but they have a different way of interacting. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. And well, we just have two more questions. One of them I usually just ask to the religious guide and people from different religions about the beliefs in the afterlife. But they are asking me to, since you are immersed in the Greek world, if it affected your views. So the question is, what do you think, in your personal belief, happens to us after we die?
Well, I try to avoid having beliefs in things that I don't have, that I can't really answer in any way other than speculation. But my general sense, I had two near-death experiences last year. I had some internal bleeding going on, and I basically lost consciousness with having lost enough blood that I had to have transfusions twice. So anyway, I've kind of I've been at that edge fairly recently, and my perspective is that consciousness itself is something beyond just our physical bodies, and so we do continue afterwards, and I think that one of the functions of magical training is to be more conscious at that point, so that we can make choices about what we want to have happen as our next step, rather than just simply being caught in the sea of what's going on. And I definitely found myself feeling like I was not as well trained as I had hoped that I would be in that juncture, and so I've been trying to more fully prepare myself as I've been continuing forward. But I think that to a large degree, magic, philosophy, occultism is a preparation for death. And of course, we don't have any answers about what's past that door until we actually go there. But I mean, I've had a number of experiences outside of my near-death experiences in which I've encountered people who were deceased, and so what that means from a metaphysical construct, I don't really have an answer for that, nor do I. It's not something that I feel like we can answer. It's just sort of like asking, why is blue that color that we call blue? It just sort of is. So, of course, you guys don't call it blue. What do you call it? What's blue in Portuguese?
Blue in Portuguese is azul.
Azul. Oh, okay. So it's similar to Spanish. Yeah. So
No, that's a right question. That's a right answer. That there's no wrong answer, because I've been asking this question for over 200 people from all religious beliefs that you can imagine, and I got 200 different answers. Wow, so we are kind of making a bet here. So when we die, we all die, we will meet in the afterlife and say who was right.
Right. My real question is like the parts of me that are me, you know, the things that I like about being a human, the foods I like to eat, the women that I'm attracted to, all of those things seem very stupid in a more, like if I think of myself as a being that is eternal. So like all that stuff, all the things that I would consider to be Jason seem like just garbage that's just going to fall off as quickly as possible, you know, because like who cares about that stuff? Really? I mean, you know, if you're an entity that is beyond the physical, all that stuff seems pretty irrelevant, including your name or any of that kind of stuff, you know, who needs it?
Well, I have just two more questions for you. The first one is, how can we find you? And since this is going to YouTube and Spotify, and probably someone will be watching us a year from now. So right. Probably your tarot will be saying everything. So how can we find you?
Well, I've got a single website. I'll give you the link to it. It's just jasonaugustusnewcomb.com though. And now it has all my stuff. It's got the courses that I teach. It's got this tarot project. It's got my, you know, various other things that I make, and you know, it's got everything on it. So, and also my own interview show that I do. I don't know if you guys know that I also do an interview show.
Probably Breno knows. I had this week. It was terrible for me. I will put this information here in the description of the video. And it has been great talking to you. And our last question is, what advice would you give to someone that's very beginning? In Brazil, we have a very young audience. Mm-hmm. People who are, we are a very Catholic country, but people are beginning to see that the religion is more like a show business. And a lot of kids are very irritated with the church, and they're beginning to come to the magic world. So we had a lot of chaos magicians and telemites and hermetics and everything, and they will see probably this video. And what advice would you give to someone who is starting at magic?
Okay, well, I would say that you want to balance exploration with reading, and that reading shouldn't become an obsession, because I think that it does for a lot of people. And the more you read, the more you realize that this one was wrong and this one is more correct, and you just end up getting lost in a sea of information. I think much more important is to begin to explore consciousness. I think that developing the inner skill of being able to see visions, both with your eyes closed or looking into a scrying device or of some sort, is something that you should really develop as quickly as possible, because it's sort of like the essential skill to effectively doing magic, whether you're dealing with an entity or not. The ability to kind of like perceive the energies around you in some palpable way is incredibly useful. So I would do that, and also just meditation in general, learning to it isn't necessarily learning to be one pointed in your focus, but learning to have that aspiration towards looking at the world as a whole, rather than, you know, from the fragmented ego consciousness that we spend most of our time in.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much for your time. It has been a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for this interview. We have been in love with your project since the first time someone saw it in the Indiegogo and spread it here. And they are asking me, since I said, we are going to interview him. And they say, ask him when it's coming to Brazil, because of the problem that I said. Some of I believe Kickstarter doesn't even send to Brazil, because our mail here is crappy. Right. And they lost their packages, and we have a lot of problems with Kickstarters and things like that. So I promised that I will talk to you after the show to convince you to publish your tarot when it's ready and finish everything in Portuguese. But for now, thank you so much for your time. It has been great.
It's been really nice talking to you. You've been a delightful host, and thank you all of you who have asked questions in the background.
All right. E em português de novo, se você assistiu a gente até agora, não esquece de dar like, segue o canal, aperta os botãozinhos e a gente se vê aí no próximo bate-papo Mayhem.